Thank you so much for being willing to sit down, Lee. I stumbled upon your work in a research article that I saw, and I didn't feel like I learned enough from it. So I felt it was important that we have a conversation because you were the one who did the background research on wolf culling and what's taking place. Would you mind just giving listeners a brief introduction of yourself?
Myself, well, I was born and raised in California. Degree in wildlife management, Humboldt State University, 1970. Immigrated to Canada right soon thereafter. My first job, not really a real job, but really for fun, was guiding for big game up in northern B.C., up along the Alaska Highway. So I guided for moose, caribou, mountain goats, mountain sheep.
And you're a biologist.
I'm a biologist, yes, a wildlife biologist.
And how did you get started in that?
Oh, well, I could make it long or short, but the medium form is in high school, sophomore in high school, 10th grade, my biology teacher came to me. He was also my coach, my track coach. I was on the track team, also the football team. And he said, Lee, if you don't get your grades up in biology, you're off the teams. So he had assigned a project to pick a wild animal and do a presentation on it. So I picked beavers. I really got into beavers, and there were beavers. We lived on the sort of edge of town there, and I was in the habit of walking them down the creeks, hunting and fishing, just fooling around in the woods. There were beavers there, so I got an A plus, first A plus he'd ever given, and I stayed on the team. That's what got me started in wildlife studies.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, let's get started right away into the wolf cullings. So when I read the article, I thought it was hyperbolous when I first saw it. I couldn't have imagined that we in British Columbia send out helicopters and planes to gun down wolves at mass. It was like, I think, 1,600 over 5 years. Can you tell us what's going on? How did this get started? How did you start learning about this?
Well, I mentioned I guided for big game. So there were wolves, moose, caribou up there. Our hunters liked to shoot a wolf if they ran across it. We didn't target them specifically. And also one time a wolf came into the ranch where I stayed. I was in the bunkhouse and the rancher was out away somewhere. And his wife came running to me and like panic stricken. There's a wolf. The wolf was like 200 yards out, sort of coming towards the chicken coop. But anyway, she wanted me to shoot it. So I levered a 220 grain bullet into my rifle and aimed carefully high and to the right and missed it. And she thought I was a bad shot, and then the wolf ran off. Anyway, not long after that, well, it was a while after that. That was 1970. In the mid 80s, there was a lot of controversy about shooting wolves from helicopters or otherwise. I wrote a couple of articles about it, drawing on my experience as a hunting guide. And I'm also a biologist. I sort of presented a biologist look at why you should hunt wolves or not hunt wolves, and something about how to do it and when and where. At the same time, there was this really good biologist from he had been studying Newfoundland caribou, and he moved out to B.C. to study our caribou, which were declining. They had declined quite a bit from when I first guided for them, which must have been at the peak of their population, and they've been going down ever since. I think they had been going up until then. Of course, nobody knows because there were no surveys, but anyway, by 85, even the province was concerned about the declining population of caribou, and this guy came out, this good biologist, and he did a good, careful study, lots of field data. I read the papers. And he said that there were so many wolves that they were not really hunting caribou per se, but they would like spill over into caribou country and snag a few, usually young ones. So recruitment was down. Recruitment is the new ones added to the population the year after they're born. So like the following year, if a calf survives his first year, he becomes a member of the herd. That's recruitment. Recruitment was way down, not so much adult caribou. So the wolves were clearly targeting calves and yearlings. But the wolf population was high. It was thought, this guy said, because the moose and elk populations were high. Deer, I suppose, but up in that north country there weren't many deer, and that's where he did the study. It was up in the north Williston Lake area. So the wolf population was high, and they were mainly hunting moose and elk, but there were enough of them that they would chance to stumble on enough caribou to, reduce the recruitment of caribou, and thence the population was in a downward trajectory.
Right.
It's a good study. So the province decided to, even before those studies were published, with sort of the raw data, they decided to start hunting wolves from helicopters. And it was controversial. I wrote a couple of articles about it, one in the B.C. Outdoors magazine, and another one, full page in the Vancouver Sun newspaper, just sort of giving a biologist a look at it. Anyway, that's when I first got really involved in the issue. I hadn't studied wolves professionally up to then, or caribou.
Yeah. So this was Tom Bertrude, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, Bergerud, yes.
Okay. And he basically said that this is incidental, that the wolves were not seeking out hunting caribou, that it was just kind of they'd land upon some and then take out what sounds like the younger ones. And so the argument, it sounds like, the government is making in the articles that I've seen in CTV, CBC, in various places, is that the reason that we're hunting wolves by plane or by helicopter is to bring down the effects on the caribou. We're trying to save the caribou in BC, and killing the wolves is going to help us accomplish that goal. What are your thoughts on that, as a biologist who's looked into the matter?
Well, the initial studies were good, competent, careful, well-researched, published in top journals, and there were several papers that came out of this work. The problem is, as I see it, first of all, it became like a paradigm for all the young biologists, caribou biologists that were coming out of university, and they also taught this idea in the universities. I don't think they took into account the 100-year scale trajectory of wolf populations. Be that as it may, wolves were high and probably increasing, along with the increasing populations of deer, elk, and moose. So that became the paradigm. But the problem is that the government and its consultants, consultants work for the government, or the consultants work for logging companies, basically, in most of our area, some oil and gas companies up north. They applied that idea like to the whole province, like the whole of mountain caribou range. And mountain caribou, I'm only talking about the mountain caribou of British Columbia and Yukon, not other kinds of caribou that live in the Arctic or in the boreal forest. Anyway, that became the paradigm, but they applied it even in the Selkirk Mountains, where I built a cabin in 1971. It was sort of my dream come true to move to Canada and build a cabin in the wilderness. So I spent a lot of time there, back and forth, and that was sort of a home base, place to leave my backpack, and, when I was canoeing, and my canoe when I was backpacking. And I was working all over the Arctic, so I had to have a home base. But so I saw caribou, and they came down every year in winter time, and then again in spring, you'd see them down along the highways. And there were lots of caribou up in those mountains. The loggers ate them all the time because the logger would fell a bunch of trees, and the treetops would be lying on the landing, the log deck, or, the woodland landing where they pile the trees, and then the caribou would come out to eat the arboreal lichens off the trees, lichens. That's what they live on, is arboreal lichens, the kind of lichen, the hair lichen, that grows in trees. So there were lots of caribou then, but then they were declining. I thought they were declining. I had an article in, I think, 75 or 76 in BC Outdoors about, asking whether caribou were really endangered, should be listed and such, and explaining why. And that got into this whole idea that the habitat for moose, deer, and elk is like open and semi-open, with some patches of nice mature forest, but a mosaic of open areas, natural meadows, farmland, logged over areas, and burned over areas. And it's been known since the 50s that fires and perforce logging, which also destroys forests, were bad for caribou because caribou really need this mature old growth forest. And they need it in two places: in the low elevation, where they come down in wintertime. Here I'm only talking about this so-called southern mountain caribou, the Selkirk, Columbia Mountains, Purcell Mountains. That's what they call the deep snow caribou because snow builds up so deep. First of all, in the fall, they can't walk on it. There's just too much snow and too deep. So they come down to low elevation in the fall. But then in the high country, it's sort of a warm environment. It's below freezing, it's cold and it snows, but it's warm enough that the snow settles and packs. Enough so the caribou can walk on top of the snowpack. And the snow might be 10 feet deep. So the caribou, at that time of year, which is midwinter, then they go back up to the high country in the subalpine meadows and patches of forest, Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir country. Excuse me. And then they browse on these arboreal lichens, walking on top of the snowpack. They're basically feeding in the treetops. In late winter, it starts freezing and thawing, and the snow forms a crust. And the caribou can't walk on that crust. They break through. And it abrades their skin. I've actually followed blood trails where caribou are like trying to get out of that high country and get down to the low elevation, but they're breaking through the crust so much it's rubbing the skin off their legs. It's hard for them if they can't. But then they come down to the cedar hemlock forest, the low elevation, wet, moist forest, warm forest, and in the spring, and that's when it's starting to green up. The snow is already gone, especially along the sides of the roads and the avalanche paths. So that's where you would look for them. You'd see them on the road all the time in the 70s, and they're common. Excuse me. And in that area, there are no more caribou. They're gone. They've been chased out by, there were never any wolves there until about 1990, say. Not sure exactly, but my friend who hunted up in one of those valleys saw the first one anybody had ever heard of. And a year or two later, a neighbor joined the cabin in Galena Bay, which is on the base of the Selkirk Mountains. He saw one on the beach, and people started reporting wolf tracks. Wolves only came in at that time. Before that, there were never any wolves in that country. And and I saw that the first band of elk that came in that country. They came through a pass from the Kootenai drainage in there, and because there was lots of logged land by then, they were really logging to beat the band back in the 70s and early 80s, and they still are. And then the moose came a few years later. So with the moose and the elk, and there never had been any moose there at all.
Right.
On the Arrow Lake side of the Selkirk Valley, they had been, elk and moose on the other side, over in the Kootenai, but never there. And so that's, the elk came, then the moose came, and then the wolves came. So that was only up until the late 90s. And until then, there was never any predation by wolves on caribou, but the caribou populations were declining. Why? Well, the logging destroys their low elevation habitat. At that time, there were still lots of higher elevation habitat still there. There still is a fair bit, since the various caribou protection plans protected some of the higher elevation, but not low elevation. So they come down to the low elevation. There's no forest. They need the forest not so much to feed at that time of year when they come down to low elevation, fall and spring, but more they need the forest to escape the predators, which in that country was mostly cougars.
Right.
Cougars were taking a fair number, not a huge number, but some. And it turns out that, interesting paper, one cougar can learn to hunt caribou, and then that cougar will be responsible for lowering the population in the whole area.
Wow.
And then it trains its babies to hunt caribou also, and other cougars, living 10 miles away or whatever, they just hunt deer and elk like all the other cougars were doing. But anyway, that's a sideline. But that's the background. So the caribou populations were declining and been declining ever since.
Okay, so from your understanding and your research, it looks like this is primarily due to the deforestation and impacting with logging. You've also mentioned like ski areas and ski trails and stuff like that as being one of the primary impacts. Then why are we killing these wolves in this way?
Well, see, as I said, the caribou biologists growing up and coming out of university who are now, between your and my ages, they're like the mature senior biologists, whether they're working for industry or for government. They came up with this idea, and they can't shake the idea that wolves are responsible. And wolves are responsible for bringing down the recruitment in some areas, but not all areas. And that's only part of the story anyway, because, well, going back 20 years now, when the first paper started coming out about the impacts of snowmobiling and heli skiing on caribou, it harasses them. So they run around, they burn up energy in wintertime when they can ill afford it, especially the females who are carrying fetuses. And it also chases them away from their preferred habitats, which is these high elevation in midwinter when the snowmobiles and skiers or heli skiers are out. They're up there in these little patches of subalpine fir and spruce eating arboreal lichens. Well, snowmobiles just chase them away, even if they don't mean to, because just, snowmobile coming up the valley. But in fact, I've seen areas in prime caribou winter habitat where there's not a meter of snow unimpacted by snowmobile tracks.
Right.
They're just so pervasive. And it's a huge industry. And, people love snowmobiling. I do too. I never did it for recreation, but I did use it for, wildlife surveys and related things. And it's fun to get out and, race around the snow and, no roads. You can go wherever you want. But, so that's the first thing. It impacts the caribou directly, but also indirectly, because it turns out that wolves more easily and more willingly will follow a snowmobile track up into the high country where the caribou are trying to hide.
Right.
And then when the snowmobile track freezes, it gets hard like rock, so it's easy to walk on, easier for wolves, not for caribou, because caribou break through. So you have this duality where the winter habitat is being destroyed by logging, but at the same time, in both high elevation and low, there's almost no low elevation forest left in that area, well, in any area, because the loggers harvest the more easily accessible low elevation forest first.
Right.
And that's common throughout mountain caribou range. So you've got the impact of increasing elk and moose and deer populations, increasing the wolf population, and then the caribou not having any place to hide from the wolves, either at low elevation or high elevation, and the wolves more easily traveling up to the high elevation. Maybe they just go exploring. They see, well, where's this track go? Let's go find out. They get up there and they find some caribou.
Yeah.
So that has been the story. And that study that you mentioned, well, let me just explain the study. It has been this paradigm that the way to save caribou is to kill wolves, for a long time. So, well, that's, since 85 anyway. But it hadn't really been, there had been, one good series of studies up in the Peace River country. And then little bits of studies that sort of let the biologists infer that that was the case there also, but not really any concerted study. So a colleague of mine, good biologist, I know him personally, he thought he'd draw together all the studies from all these different areas. And by the late teens, 2019, his paper came out. So his research was up to about the previous year, 2018. He looked at all the different caribou populations all over with the idea of showing whether or not killing wolves could save caribou. And his data showed that where they had removed wolves, the caribou population at least stabilized and in some cases started to go back up. But when I read it, I realized he'd made some major errors. And so many that as I read it, and I got his data tables and I constructed my own data tables from his, and found some errors in the data. Let's not go there. Wouldn't have been fatal to the paper. But I realized that where the caribou populations were going down was in this, really dramatically, it was in this deep snow country. The government had tried to have a maternal pen. Shall I explain that?
Yes, please.
Well, if they're trying to protect, increase recruitment, then they need to protect the calves and yearlings. And one way to do that is to capture all the females who are about to give birth, put them in a pen, and let them give birth to their calves in this protected area with no wolves. Let the calves grow to a certain age where they can probably fend for themselves or at least outrun a wolf, and then take them back up in the high country and turn them loose.
Right.
So there was a maternal pen, some good work by the Soto and other First Nations up there, working with the government and with the companies that wanted to log, and so they were hiring biologists. So they were taking charge of their country, and they wanted to protect their animals. So they came up with this protection plan. This is in the Quincy-Zaw territory, up by I think it's between Chetwynd and Fort St. John, those mountains.
Right.
Or maybe it's a little south and west of Chetwynd. Nice country. And they did good work. They made a maternal pen. It was up in high elevation. They caught the pregnant females, all the ones they could find. They had like two subpopulations. One of them had gone almost to extinction by the time they did this. So they sort of, on paper, they merged those two populations. But they got the thing. They got the pregnant cows. They raised the calves, turned them loose, and at the same time they're culling wolves. So fewer wolves, more recruitment. Caribou population started going up. It was good work. It was well done. And sometime after that was well going, and the initial results were good. They built another maternal pen down in the southern deep snow country. Let me just clarify this deep snow. In the north, that is around the Quincy-Zaw territory, that's I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, by the way, but anyway. The snow is really light. It's colder up there in winter. It's like a continental climate. It's dry and cold relative to the southeast of B.C. And so the snow is light and fluffy and not very deep. There's not that much snow. There's not that much total precipitation, but the snow is light and fluffy. And the caribou there, they never browse arboreal lichens from the trees. They dig through the snow and they eat terrestrial lichens. Like all of the other caribou in the world, practically. They paw through the snow for terrestrial lichens. And a lot of them will stay in high elevation country where the wind blows the snow off the mountaintops, and they can browse arboreal lichens up there. And some of them go where I was guiding, for example. That's the Pink Mountain area. Those caribou would come off like en masse in the fall, late fall, and they'd go out into the muskeg and browse terrestrial lichens out there. And so every year you had this mass migration across the Alaska Highway. It was really easy to shoot a caribou. The hunters would go up, and this is early 70s I'm talking about. The hunters would go up, just line up along the Alaska Highway and wait for the caribou to come across.
Wow.
I was one of them. And yeah, it was migration that was amazing. It wasn't tens of thousands, it was, dozens.
Yeah.
So, but still, over the course of a winter, it would be many thousands of caribou that would come across from the high country. But nobody was doing winter surveys, so they didn't know if those northern caribou if some of them were still in the high country or not. They assumed that they all came out and migrated fairly long horizontal distance. So this is not the same kind of the migration I described, this double migration where in the Selkirk Mountains, where they come down twice a year. They come down in the late fall and they come down again in early spring. This is different. It's a horizontal migration, and they're totally different caribou. In fact, let me digress a moment. Since about 2000, when caribou classification was sort of revised, actually there was a major revision in 61. I won't trouble you with that. But in 2000, the Canadian government, classified caribou all over Canada, really according to the ecosystems where they lived. The ecosystems were defined on a broad scale. So the Southern Mountain ecozone was from basically Fort St. John all the way down through the Cordillera, the mountains of British Columbia. And then the Northern Mountain ecozone was all from there all the way up through the Yukon.
Right.
So those caribou were classified that, and one of the caribou, the southern mountain ecotype, as they called it, was classified as threatened. It turns out that was an error in that classification. It didn't take into account the genetic relatedness of the caribou, the ecosystem, the habitat, the behavior, or anything. It was just based on these very large scale ecozones that had been defined for some other reason. Well, since then, there's been a lot of research, including genetic research, to show relatedness among caribou populations. And these papers started coming out in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, and they showed that the caribou, these mountain caribou, weren't in fact related to the woodland caribou that live in Canada all across the prairies and the Maritimes. They were somewhat distantly, but still more closely related to those caribou, to the Arctic caribou, the tundra caribou, the ones that survived the last and maybe the previous ice age in Beringia, in the Alaska Yukon area.
Wow.
And so they're unrelated to the caribou that lived south of the ice sheets all across the rest of North America. So these mountain caribou were really not related, but according to this 2000 era classification, there were two kinds of caribou, northern mountain and southern mountain. But this more modern research with genetic, behavioral, and ecological showed that there were three kinds of mountain caribou: northern mountain, a southern mountain, which were both of these Beringian lineage. Beringia is the area of Alaska, Yukon, and eastern Siberia that was ice-free during the last ice age. So that's the Beringian lineage. And then there was another population of caribou that the geneticists defined as central mountain caribou. They turn out to be a kind of a hybrid between our other mountain caribou and woodland caribou. They're on the other side of the mountains, the eastern slope of the Rockies. Interestingly, these three types of caribou were all identified in the 1899, 1900, 1902 as separate species, and not merely subspecies or ecotypes, but actually separate species. So the mountain caribou, the mountain caribou was the southernmost in the Selkirk Mountains, was Rangifer montanus mountain caribou. The central mountain was Rocky Mountain caribou. It was a different species, and they remained as different species for most of a century. But this was not recognized by this 2000 era geographically. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but I think it's an important point.
Yeah.
It was not recognized by this 2000 era classification that was just geography based instead of lineage based or ecological or behavioral or anything. And so this has been known since the mid-2000s. In 2011, the Canadian Wildlife Service did a review of all the classification of caribou and the genetic data, the behavioral data, ecological data, relatedness among lineages based mainly on the genetics, and they defined these three that maybe not coincidentally, these three mountain ecotypes then went back to the original descriptions,
Right.
except that they weren't revised formally in a taxonomic basis. So they weren't given their old species names. They were just called ecotypes, still officially, even today, classified as subspecies of woodland caribou, which they're not even related to, at least not for the last 100,000 years.
Right. So basically, like what you're pointing out is that, like putting out like one research study is not conclusive, and there's dangers in taking one and just assuming that this is what the new reality is, and we can just take this wholeheartedly and move forward based on it. You've kind of pointed out with certain research that there's nuance to it, and that if people aren't careful, if they make assumptions, or if they breeze over certain data, that we can make a lot of big errors. And it's very concerning, and it sounds like you've been able to see just smaller errors that are important, that are relevant to our understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, you've actually said it more distinctly than I did. So that's right. So this 2019 study, they ignored these different kinds of caribou or their different kinds of habitats, behavior, ways of living, arboreal versus terrestrial lichens, just lumped them all together, and also lumped areas with different kinds of different mixes of predators, as I mentioned earlier, and they actually ignored more than half the populations of mountain caribou that they could have included in their analysis. And it turns out the ones they ignored were the ones that didn't fit their hypothesis. The way to kill wolves or the way to save caribou is to kill wolves, because there were a lot of populations where they had removed wolves, but the caribou population still went down. And they had included one or two populations like that, but they had ignored these other caribou. So there was a fundamental flaw. There were other fundamental, really, I think, fundamental flaws. The study purported to show that the amount of good caribou habitat, which they equated to, forest versus non-forest, was not a factor. But they used invalid metrics, invalid data for what was caribou habitat, unaccountably, because data were actually available. They ignored what we call in science and in statistical analysis confounding variables. That's a variable that might influence the results that you should account for in your study design. So they ignored the impact of snowmobiles, which from 2000, when the papers first started coming out, until now, it's just gone up exponentially. Literally, if you look at the data, it is an exponential increase in snowmobile use. And of course, the local chambers of commerce love it, and tour guides love it, and it's good for business. So good, in fact, that the provincial government just refuses to even talk about limiting snowmobile use in critical caribou habitat now. In 2000, let me just backtrack a bit. 2008, the province came out with a new caribou recovery plan. Total disaster. 9 populations have gone extinct since they came out with this plan. But in it, they tried to account for the impact of snowmobiles and heli-skiing on caribou by enacting closures where these machines were not allowed. Winter motorized recreation is the sort of unwieldy term. But from when the science team that they had developing this plan, they made these recommendations based on keeping these snowmobiles and heli-skiing out of winter critical habitat. But the negotiated boundaries of the closures were much less than the science team had recommended, because they just didn't want to restrict the use of snowmobiles because it was so important to local communities economically. Then the other flaw about that was the closures were mostly ineffective. There was no enforcement mechanism. There were several other reasons. I won't bore you with the detail about why the closures were ineffective, but they were, and demonstrably so. Anyway, this 2000 study didn't account for that. So my colleagues and I sort of redid the study, reanalyzed the data, found totally different results, and published a paper saying that the study was flawed. Well, that doesn't mean it was wrong, just because they failed to prove to our satisfaction that their central hypothesis that if you kill enough wolves, the caribou will be protected. It might just be that they failed to prove it, and a properly designed study would show the same thing.
Right.
And that's basically what they said was, and they've published some papers since, to their credit, correcting the errors that we identified, though they didn't give us credit for it. And they go on saying this, but they're careful not to apply that too much, like in southern areas. The southern Selkirk caribou herd was dwindling, but through the 2000s, there were still dozens of caribou in that herd, even though it had gone down quite a bit. This is right on the border. Well, they went extinct in 2018 after they had killed all the wolves.
So it didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, they killed all the wolves, and the population still went extinct.
Right.
And this is just an anecdote, but if you look at the data, especially throughout the southern, mountain area, southern mountain caribou area, there's just no relationship at all with killing wolves and saving caribou. Right. Caribou were going down anyway.
Can you explain why it's so important that we save the caribou? Can you just give us like an understanding of what the value they bring to the ecosystem that listeners might, like, I've never seen a caribou, I've never interacted with one. It's hard to develop that relationship with something when you don't have a good understanding of what they are and how they live and how they impact their ecosystems.
But you do recall the image on one side of the Canadian quarter, right?
Yes.
It's a caribou.
Right.
And that's because caribou was so important to the founding and development of modern Canada. Well, of the colonial period, but also the pre-colonial period when throughout the country, the First Nations people always lived on caribou. They hunted them, they ate them, and they had myths about them, and I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say myths, but they had stories about the caribou and how they related to the people. And this is, I worked with First Nations people all over this country, well over the western and northern parts of this country, and they all had deep regard for caribou. Anyway, if you never saw a caribou, well, first of all, I'm sad to say you probably never will. Although if you go up north, northern Yukon, far enough, northern BC and Yukon, you still can see caribou. There still are some there. They're still hunted in some parts of northern BC. So there still are some caribou. In northern Yukon, you can go in Yukon and all over the Mackenzie, there's still caribou. And of course, in the high Arctic, there's herds of tens of thousands.
As a biologist who's had the opportunity to hunt them, to be involved with them, to see them live, what is it like to find out that like certain species of them have gone extinct?
Well, here's an example that's close to me. I told you that I used to see them all the time after I built my cabin, and just driving around the logging roads, even the main highway. There were always caribou there, in late fall. My son and I went for a mountain hike. He was a young man just striking out on his own, but he and I got together in 1999, and we went up in the mountains behind the cabin, and there were a fair number of caribou up there. And he took pictures, I took pictures, and bull caribou and females with calves, and a nice. This is right behind our cabin, and it's up in the high country. Well, he treasures that time. He knows he'll never see a caribou, and his son, my grandsons, my granddaughter, they'll never see one. Not around there anyway. They have to go up to the Yukon to see a caribou, right, because there just aren't any left. That whole big block of mountains where my cabin is, aerial monitoring of caribou population shows that there's none there. And they've just been chased away by the heli skiers and snowmobilers, and a few have been eaten by wolves, although that's hardly been documented in this area. A few have been eaten by cougars. That population is still hanging on, but it's not in that block of mountains. It's further back. There still are about 24 at last count.
Right.
And when I moved in there were like hundreds. The first survey, which was after they'd been declining for years, there were around 400 caribou in that patch of mountains.
So how fast was that decline from when there were 400 to when there was none? How long was that period?
That's about 20 years.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So in that population, that's now the southernmost population of mountain caribou in Canada, and there are about 24 in that population, where there used to be 400. And further to the south, another population, southern Selkirk population, is gone. Southern Purcell population, gone. Across the lake, where I could see the mountain tops peeking up through the trees from my cabin, that whole range of Monashees used to be caribou habitat. I've seen caribou habitat. I've seen caribou there.
Yeah.
None. Zero. They went to zero and declared functionally extinct in 2016, I think it was.
Wow.
Another population up between Revelstoke and the Alberta border, gone. None there. And there, of the 18 or so subpopulations of southern mountain caribou, 9 of them, at least 9, are completely extinct. And some of them only have 2 or 3 animals at last count, which was a couple of years ago.
Right.
So, I feel bad for the caribou because I know them. I hunted them. I was there when they were at their peak of their population. And when I was guiding, we would carry beef and pork up with us up into the high country in the panniers and backpacks of the pack horses. But when that, over a long hunt, it would run out, and then we thought nothing of shooting a young caribou bull for camp meat.
Yeah,
it was just the way it was done. It was technically illegal, but even the wildlife service guys that we'd meet with occasionally acknowledged that, and they said, "Oh, we're not going to trouble about that. There's lots of caribou."
Yeah, and now that's a completely different.
Yeah. It wasn't long after that they began closing the hunting over most of the province, including the area around my cabin in Selkirk. All that area has been closed for almost 50 years now. But still the populations are going down. And like I said, they're still hunting them in the north, where there still is huntable populations. And there are some guides and outfitters that make a good living taking clients. And there are some clients that are very happy to have a chance to shoot a caribou. I just think it'd be a shame to lose the caribou. I mean, we have lost so many already, so many like whole subpopulations.
Yeah.
I think it's completely possible that we'll lose the whole of the southern population, which this genetic research shows are unique. They're not part of this so-called, southern mountain ecozone that the government defined erroneously in 2000.
Yeah.
They're unique, and we're going to lose them. And sooner rather than later, I think in my lifetime, I'm 70, I'll be 75 soon. That's how long I think the last ones will last.
And let's get into what's going on with the government's kind of handling of this, because and I think that this is where it's important for listeners to understand, there is a process in which the government, like we talk about studies and we talk about research, and that makes people feel good that research is taking place or something like that. But from how you've kind of described it, the government preferentially chooses consultants, perhaps research that goes along with their economic goals, that meet certain objectives that they have, independent of whether or not they're going to actually save the caribou. And so you kind of laid out that they brought together these committees, and that they put one committee together, and then they fired them, and then they brought another committee in, and then they disbanded that, and then they brought in another to try and get information that they hoped that they would hear. They were kind of trying to figure out who's going to give us what we want to hear. Can you describe that to listeners, just what took place?
Well, the the government started getting worried about caribou. In '85, there was a workshop in Kamloops. Uh, about 10 years later, and also there were some big land use management plans in that era that were being developed. What do they call them? There was an acronym for it, I forget anyway. Land use management plans being developed, and so they put together this science team of biologists, and so the first caribou recovery plan was, I think it was dated '95 thereabouts. And they did actually protect some area. They drew lines, around high mountain caribou habitat, not low mountain, because they didn't want to take away the fiber for the pulp mills and the sawmills. But anyway, they recommended that they seriously curtail logging in critical caribou habitats. Well, the government didn't like that, so they put the report on the shelf, buried it as deeply as they could. No, I have a copy.
What do you mean when you say they buried it? Like,
well,
what
sorry,
is
I'm being a little flippant. They just ignored it. They fired the biology, or disbanded the committee that they had assembled to advise them, and they formed another committee with other biologists. Some of them were the same ones.
How do they go about justifying that? What are their reasons to say these biologists are not helpful, or they didn't come to useful like, how do you go about getting rid of one committee and switching it out without drawing attention to yourself? Because a layperson like me goes, well, what's wrong with these biologists, and what are these other biologists going to do that's different?
I can't answer that. I mean, the government just didn't want to know it, and logging's an important industry, and they just said, well, let's find a solution that doesn't involve curtailing logging. So then they formed another committee, and they came with a report 2002, same thing. So they disbanded the committee, put the report on the shelf, and formed another, what they called a caribou science team. And they seemed like they were really going to get serious this time. And from 2000 to 2006, 2008, that team worked, and they came up with a third caribou recovery plan. It was really difficult. The negotiations were really hard and protracted. I had friends in the environmental groups that were, on the committee. Some of them left because their opinions weren't being heard, and the ones that stayed sort of just bit their tongue and toughed it out. Negotiations were really hard. The logging companies, they had representatives on the committees, and there was like a main committee, and then there was a political committee, and then a science committee, and then regional committees, like for every herd, every group of caribou herds. And they did their best to come up with a good plan. And in the area behind my cabin, it actually wasn't too bad. They ended up saving a fair amount of caribou high elevation habitat, mainly because the Valhalla Wilderness Society and two or three other wild site, I forget which environmental groups, they really dug in their heels. And they were about to lose the whole thing, and then politically, I think that the government just said, well, no, let's give them that. It's high elevation, timber's not worth much anyway. But the process was constrained politically. The marching orders in 2006 were to not have a plan that reduces the amount of logging. And that's a bit of an overstatement. It provided for some logging, some potentially loggable stands of forest being protected as caribou habitat. But overall, there was like a zero net loss. A no net loss policy was given to them at the start in 2006, where the government at the political level wasn't willing to accept any loss of fiber flow to the sawmills and pulp mills. So that's what the people on these committees, that's what they had to work with. They worked really hard. I mean, they were, drawing, maps, and they had these GIS systems spewing out maps one after the other as they negotiated. They reach a point, they say, okay, good, let's draw these lines, and then they would be back to the drawing board the next week, trying, the logging company would say, look, that's a really valuable piece of timber right there. Let us log that and take this other forest that timber isn't as valuable for logging, but still good for caribou, and let the caribou have that. So there were a lot of this give and take, and it was really tough negotiations. I credit all the people with working hard. The problem is that they had this constraint.
Yeah.
And it ended up being there's zero recognition of this low elevation habitat that the caribou absolutely need.
Right. This is very frustrating to hear because you're talking about conservation. I'm in law school right now, and we talk about the Delgamuke case. We talk about the Marshall decision, and the Supreme Court of Canada basically says something like, you're allowed to have your Indigenous rights and title so long as conservation is met. And when you're describing how conservation works, where we bring in industries who, in my opinion, shouldn't be at that table, and even if they are allowed to be at that table for economic purposes, because I do understand we have an important economy and natural resources are important, they should not be able to set the requirements of what's not like having a net zero impact on my business. That doesn't seem like a middle ground to me. And so when I learn about decisions about conservation and how the government of Canada and BC is able to limit Indigenous rights and title for the sake of conservation, and then you start describing how conservation discussions and committees take place, it sounds like less to do with the science of what's actually going to save these caribou and more about political kind of movements and how are we going to make sure the economy is not impacted while we try and save these caribou. And it doesn't sound like it's 100% we're going to save these caribou. It's, well, what's the low-hanging fruit that's not going to impact anything? What was that like to watch? Do you think that this is an effective system that it sounds like good work was still done, but would you like to see these committees in the future set up differently? Is it better under an NDP government versus a Liberal government? Because it sounds like 2006, that would have been the Liberal government. Gordon Campbell, if I'm not mistaken, would have been leading that. Would that have made any impact? Do you see improvements now with an NDP government? They seem to tout more care for the environment.
No, I don't think so. This letting the caribou decline because of habitat loss has been going on through several changes of government. I don't think the NDP has been any better. The NDP, they talk well, but they have all these. Oh, let's go back a minute. 2017, I, as an individual, wrote a letter to the federal minister of environment. They have this Species at Risk Act, which provides for emergency orders. So I'd had enough. So I wrote to her and I said to the minister, I said, they're logging in caribou critical habitat. This is habitat defined as critical by the federal government in 2014 when the federal government came out with their recovery plan. So I said, look, and I just there are pictures of logging in the area behind my cabin and caribou habitat. I asked her to do an emergency order and stop the logging, and also stop snowmobiling and some other, just those two, snowmobiling and logging. Well, two other groups. I was an individual, but two groups of environmental people or about the same time were developing similar requests for orders. We shared notes, I have to tell you. One up north and one in the south. Valhalla Wilderness Society was one. So the minister received these three requests for emergency orders to stop the logging and snowmobiling in critical and federally designated critical caribou habitat in several areas up in the southern caribou country. Well, to do that, the Species at Risk Act lets the federal government do it, but to do so, they have to step on the province's toes. And then there's a process that has to go through. So right away, the feds contacted the province. I don't know what they might have said. I've sought the correspondence through Free Access to Information Act. They delayed, and they finally sent me all this redacted stuff that I can't even see who was writing to whom. Anyway, they consulted with the province, and the province realized that this is a really big deal. If the feds have to step in and give these emergency orders, that's going to be a big impact on our snowmobiling, heli hiking, and logging industry. So the province then seemed to get serious, and they formed a committee. They worked with the Saulteaux First Nation up north, not just the Saulteaux. There's two or three bands involved. I forget all which they were. It was led by the Saulteaux, I think. And good people. Worked hard. They put in. I told you about their maternity pen.
Yeah.
And wolf calling. Those are northern caribou. They're not even southern mountain caribou. Anyway, the government started developing this. Both governments, mainly the province, led by the province. They started negotiating an improved recovery plan. And they first had a formal agreement with those First Nations up north, which they saw as a critical way of proceeding, which was right and proper. But to do that, they delayed dealing with the southern herds or the southern peoples whose territory includes those herds. But then they started working towards an overarching agreement, which they finally signed, I think, about a little less than a year ago, for these southern areas. But then now they're working on like herd-specific plans. So the umbrella agreement covers general principles, and then they have to have a plan for each herd. Well, in the process, they're completely ignoring my paper that said that this previous paper was flawed, and that killing wolves might not be the best way to save caribou, and that there are, in fact, other ways that whether you kill caribou or kill wolves or not, you still have to do these other things, otherwise you're going to have no caribou. And those other things are habitat protection and limiting winter motorized recreation in their habitat.
Right.
So I think I'm kind of rambling about and getting to the answer to your question, but no, I don't think it's the Liberal or Conservative or NDP government that is the solution. What I think is the solution is let the First Nations people manage the wildlife and the habitat in their territories. They'll do a much better job of it than, frankly, the provincial or the federal governments will. And we've shown that already in the Quincy-Zaw territory up north. Those are Dene people.
Yeah. So it doesn't look like forming these committees is very effective. And the other thing I'm kind of getting out of this is that there's a problem with not bringing in people like yourself. Like, you've worked with various organizations as a biologist. Why aren't they consulting with you? Like, when I'm reading these interesting articles about, and they're referencing your work of, there's no statistical evidence to support wolf culling to save caribou habitats. You've helped inform, it sounds like, even though they didn't give you credit, they've given you credit for, like, they've followed your work, but they have not acknowledged your involvement. Why aren't they bringing in individuals like yourself who've been working on this, it sounds like, for about 20 years now? You've been at least monitoring the situation. Whether or not you're coming out with papers every year, irrelevant. You've been monitoring the policies that are taking place, what you think would be genuine solutions. You propose papers, you help address the problems that are going on. Why aren't they saying, hey, Lee, you gotta get in here. Let's figure out a plan to save these caribou. That seems to be why we're investing all this money in all these consultants. Let's just get it done. Let's make sure that we at least have the caribou into the future. What's going on?
Well, I'm afraid I've burned a few bridges, made, I don't know, not enemies exactly, but I'm sort of persona non grata in this fraternity of caribou biologists. It's not that they don't think that I'm right, and myself and my co-authors. There's been enough follow-up work showing that our paper criticizing this previous paper was completely valid. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear the message. And it's not so bad. It's not like shooting the messenger. I mean, I'm a good biologist. I have a good reputation. My biologist can't be ruined by people getting mad at me. I still publish in journals. But the people reading the journals, they agree with me. the academics, the scientists in the universities who are working on these problems, we're all in agreement about what the problem is and what the solutions are. The government just doesn't want to hear it, so they don't want to hear me.
I just don't understand how you can, like, why even bother? Why even tell people that you're trying to save the caribou then? As they've implemented plans in place, they've failed, they've killed wolves by helicopter, which I'd like to talk more about. But they've done the things and it hasn't worked. You've said that they've gone extinct since bringing in these policies. So why even waste their time trying to say that they're trying to save the caribou? Why even have any committees at all if they're not going to have any impact? If they're not going to hear from people like yourself? Like I have trouble understanding why even give the lip service at all.
I couldn't have said it better myself. But basically what it is the federal threat of these emergency orders was so profound. The province, as I see it, and this is just my personal opinion, but this is what it looks like to me, the province is going through all the lip movements of protecting caribou just to keep the feds from coming with these emergency orders. And it wasn't, like I said, it was not just my request for emergency order. There were these two others, well written, well thought out, that spurred the federal government into action, and that spurred the provincial government into action. But they're not going to. Well, a caribou biologist who I know and respect in the Kootenays told colleagues of mine, not me directly, in a formal meeting, they just would not hear about limiting snowmobiles. This is in the area of that herd that I mentioned, now the southernmost herd, after several other subpopulations have gone extinct. Southernmost herd gone from 400 animals down to 26 at last count, and pervasive with snowmobiles and caribou habitat, and the government won't even think about limiting, won't even talk about it.
Do you think that at all, like, I don't know if you've heard of Ten Tree, but they're a company you buy, I think they're based out of Vancouver. You buy like a sweater and they agree to plant 10 trees for when you buy their clothing. So I have some 10 tree sweaters, they plant trees as a consequence of my purchase. Do you think there's I think of people who go snowmobiling, who enjoy these recreations. I'm sure that regular consumers that are enjoying these experiences, they don't want to contribute to the death of caribou or the extinction of caribou, all for them to go riding. Is there a way we can take their money and invest it and have them pay a little bit extra when they go snowmobiling or when they go heli skiing, and have that money dedicated towards protecting the caribou so that everybody wins? They get to have their snowmobiling and their skiing, and we take some of that money and we protect the caribou. That seems like an easier solution than convincing government officials, who are usually hoping for purse strings, to make some difference, to actually address this issue. Because as a consumer, if you start warning people, hey, you do this, you're going to make the caribou extinct, there's going to be a little bit of guilt there on everyday consumers like myself of like, I don't want to be a part of that. I know that we're losing biodiversity in the world, and I don't want to be a contributor to that. Do you think that that would be a solution that would perhaps persuade these big industries looking at building giant spaces for heli-skiing to say, hey, if you pay $20 more each time you come, we're going to put that money towards protecting the caribou? Do you think that that's a solution at all?
That's an interesting idea, and the idea is well presented. I wish there were more people like you working on these problems. But let me ask you one question. Those 10 trees, where were they planted?
Oh, I have no idea.
See, that's the problem. When I was a Cub Scout leader, and my son was in the Cub Scouts way back when, we had a program to plant trees. I think the Scouts did it every year for a while. And where we planted trees was, we had a hard time finding them in our neighborhood. So we went up and down the vacant lots. We planted trees all over the vacant lot, rights away, and along the roadsides. Well, every single place we planted trees was later, not much later, subdivided, and those trees were gone. The federal government, as an election promise, they were going to plant, 2 billion trees? Yeah. Where? The thing is, where are they going to plant these trees? When you log, when you take down the forest, you're required to replant, and they replant. There's a vigorous tree replanting program in Canada in British Columbia. It employs a lot of people, and a lot of companies make a good living raising trees, and the timber harvest companies, they have to replant them. Less so on naturally burned areas that are outside of the commercial timber zone. Leave that aside. But anyway, within the commercial timber area, they're required to plant trees, and that's all, virtually all the caribou habitat is in those areas where the companies are planting trees anyway.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is not that they're not reforesting, so planting the trees isn't going to help. The problem is that they've cut down so many and so quickly that it's going to take, even if they stop logging completely in caribou low elevation winter habitat, it will still be 300 years until the forest grows up, and like the lichens that they eat are fairly slow growing.
Right.
They're a combination of fungus and plant. They're fairly slow growing. These forests that they're cutting are 250, 300 years old at a minimum. Well, that's a long time to wait until you've got caribou habitat, and especially if you think caribou are going to be extinct in the area in a couple of decades.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm hoping to have the person from Tentry on to explain more about what you're saying, because you're right, that we risk going back down a path of lip service if we let corporations basically say, look, we're saving the caribou. I would just say perhaps that you can have a little bit more optimism, because it's easier to see. You're saying that in the next 20 years we could have no caribou left. And so if they're saying that they're helping with this and then the caribou do go extinct, well, then they didn't really help.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that the 10 trees idea is not a good idea. It's just not good for caribou.
Yeah.
It might be good for a lot of other, birds, deer, whatever.
Yeah.
But then there's there's the lesson of Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, where somebody maybe like yourself came up with the idea that if all the world's conservationists got together and paid Brazil to not log their rainforest, and Brazil could take that money instead of the tax money that would otherwise get from logging, although they don't get much because most of it's illegal, but that's a side issue. So Brazil actually accepted many millions of dollars from the international conservationist community to not log portions of their rainforest, the biggest rainforest on the planet.
Yeah. Considered like a lung to the planet, right?
Yeah, lung to. Well, then they get this new conservative, not tarring him with that brush intentionally, but he's a conservative politician, Bolsonaro. He's really a pro-business guy. He dismantled all these agreements. And he turns a blind eye to the illegal logging. He permits more legal logging in areas where he dares, and then where he doesn't dare, he just has his people. He has actually dismantled the environmental and forestry management parts of agencies that would have caught illegal logging. We're catching illegal logging,
right,
and limiting legal logging to areas where it wouldn't do that much harm. So now, I just heard on the paper yesterday, there's been more logging of the Amazon rainforest in the past year than ever.
Right.
This is after the international community.
And all the fires that were taking place, a year or two ago?
Oh yeah, those fires, they were devastating. On top of the fires now we're logging again.
Yeah, and from my understanding, we do get a lot of pharmaceutical positive benefits from the Amazon, and it's so biodiverse, that there's a lot to get out of those areas.
Yeah. This is much to the detriment of the native people that live in those areas too, and they have themselves fought against logging and other encroachment in their territories for 100 years, and they're losing the battle. They don't like it. They're not happy, but there's nothing they can do, and even less they can do now with this particular president.
Right.
So it's they're losing their livelihoods if they don't leave their villages and go to Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo and get a job driving truck or whatever. Then they're not going to be able to make a living from the forest because the forest is gone.
So we talk a lot about climate change. It's a big topic for a lot of people. And part of climate change is the lack of biodiversity. So do you feel like it is a lot of lip service, or do you feel like there's a lot of good initiatives taking place that we can all be very optimistic about?
Well, I'm of two minds. There's a lot of really good work that's being done. Theoretical work, and you've mentioned some ideas that have, and some of that's been put into practice. So there's practical work, like 10 trees is a good idea. And there's a lot of, if you go through the climate change and the biodiversity, by the way, you probably didn't know this, the International Convention on Biological Diversity, the Biodiversity Convention, was signed in my office
Really?
when I worked for the Canadian Wildlife Service.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Well, they just needed Brian Mulroney acceded to the treaty on behalf of Canada.
Yeah.
In my office, he signed the documents.
Wow.
And they just needed a space with a nice view out the window, I guess. Anyway, but I was involved in that, from a lowly sort of mid-level bureaucrat working for Environment Canada. Biodiversity Convention was a good idea, and there's been an awful lot of good work. Well, you've heard the COP26 or whatever on that relates to climate change. So there's been a lot of curtailment of greenhouse gases for climate change. And before that, we actually solved the ozone problem. 1987, the Montreal Protocol, where all the countries of the world got together and agreed to limit chlorofluorocarbons or to ban them. And at that time, there were holes in the stratospheric ozone layer, and you know all that story. So it's not that we can't do these things. We actually solved that one problem.
What was that like to see play out from your perspective? Because I don't think I was.
You weren't even born.
I wasn't born yet, but it looks like one of the best case studies that we can do good. We can, like for Indigenous people, it's commonplace to consider ourselves stewards for the land. That seems lost on perhaps other cultures, on other communities, in comparison. And so I feel like that's a good case study for people to go, it is possible to make a good difference, to set a good example, to be a part of something good. But sometimes it seems like climate change is so broad. Like I see we had the floods here in the Fraser Valley, and politicians leaped on the opportunity to start blaming climate change rather than admitting that the dike systems were like a 1 out of 4 in terms of their quality. And then it's like, it seems disingenuous to blame. And then you get people who are skeptical of climate change because they're like, well, the dikes were not repaired properly. And then you're saying it's climate change, even though if we look at the dikes, that's your responsibility as the government to maintain. Then we get into infighting because people are so confused on, is it climate change? Is it man-made errors and failures in governments? Do you feel like we're all on the same page and that good things are going to come in the future in terms of these steps? And what do you think of what happened with the ozone layer?
Well, the ozone layer was a good success. I guess it was because it was only one industry and one chemical, and it was sort of easy. People could get their minds around it. Once they understood the physics, how the chlorofluorocarbons, this molecule goes up and it damages an ozone molecule, and then that ozone molecule is gone, but the chlorofluorocarbon molecule is still there and goes and damages, and that's what propagates. People could get their minds around it. Climate change is harder, but I've not understood why reasonable people and smart people resisted so long. I published my first paper on the effects of weather on the capacity of a particular West Coast environment in 1988. In that same year, I went to the first meeting of federal bureaucrats like myself and some sort of politicians sub one to deal with climate change. And these are federal bureaucrats. Somebody from Ottawa came and tabled some draft legislation that would limit climate change right now. You could use regulations to put a limit on how much carbon people could discharge, or carbon dioxide plus methane, depending on how it's configured. So that would have been easy. This was 1988.
Non-controversial at the time, I assume, in comparison to now.
Well, no, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
At that time, the government still didn't admit that climate change. It said physics looked like it was a possibility, but the data weren't in saying it was actually happening. that didn't come until 91, the first big international report. Well, coincidentally, I mean, I had done this study and didn't even relate to that. I was working for the Environmental Protection Service and the pulp mills, and the pulp mills were polluting. And we had this incident where a whole salmon run was destroyed in the area where the pulp mill was polluting, not because of the pulp mill per se, although it contributed, but the problem was that the water got too warm, unreasonably warm. It had never been that warm. This was the Sumas River. So it was effective weather. My paper was the effective weather. I didn't realize it was part of climate change. But it wasn't long until, and then I had a job for Environment Canada where I was supposed to look forward to some coming problems that we'd have to deal with. And it all had to do with biological diversity, really. But and that was actually in the lead up to the Rio Convention on Biological Diversity. At the same time, I was looking at the climate trends, and I realized that the precipitation was going up on the coast. There were several things, insect infestations were going up. My research was, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. My report came out in 94, after it had been peer reviewed. The whole thing was peer reviewed twice because the politicians couldn't believe what they were reading the first time, or the managers. So then, this was 94. I had some chapters on effective climate change. And then the government was going into the Kyoto protocol meetings in Kyoto, and they needed to be briefed. So some of us, myself and some others who could contribute, we actually wrote a book, a good big thick book on climate change projections and environmental response to the climate change, to the projections for B.C. and Yukon. I wrote the environmental response chapter. And so that was basically, it was published in 97, same year as the Kyoto protocols. Well, there was good science. The good science underlying the climate change projection, and good science underlying the response to the climate change protection. And we mentioned the Sumas River and the Abbotsford and Sumas Lake and the dikes. And that was like prominent in the thing, in the report. And most of it not by me. Other people, the dike experts, the river flow experts wrote those sections. So that was 97. And by that time, I had already had some years of looking at this climate change issue. And from then until, only 2 or 3 years ago, all the governments of the world basically ignored it or denied it. And then they had these climate change denial people saying that the science wasn't true, mainly, I don't know where they come from, where they get these ideas, but mainly in the States, but supported by the oil industry, who had a lot to lose if they started putting controls on emissions of carbon dioxide or methane. I don't understand why, since I wrote these reports, and I was only one of many biologists and meteorologists and physical environment specialists, it's been known since then. And why are we still now just debating it? And Canada has, I'm sorry to say, has just not been effective in developing their climate change plans. No government, not liberal, not conservative, in Canada, just completely ineffective. And they come up with all these ideas that I think are crazy. The tax structure. Well, the tax structure looked like it had a chance of working, but carbon trading credits and everything, and it's like your 10 trees. It's a good idea, but if it's not implemented right, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And they're not taking it seriously. They're not taking it so seriously that they have to actually, curtail industry.
My struggle, I guess, is that on everyday people, we feel, I think it's comparable to the idea of original sin in the biblical stories. The idea that when people go shopping, when they drive their car, when they take a flight somewhere, there's like a deep guilt about I'm destroying the planet. And when I'm driving my car, like people feel better about themselves when they get an electric car. We feel pretty good about this ourselves when we think of BC Hydro because it's less harmful than perhaps other routes. But there's this personal guilt I see so many people carry when it comes to shopping, when it comes to buying products. We're looking for the little green leaves because the little green leaves make us feel like we're not bad people anymore, and it makes us feel like we're on the right track. And then when you start describing how the government's handled caribou, when they're perhaps not doing things that would actually make a positive impact because it's not friendly to industries or it's not going to be supported by certain companies, it's concerning because all the weight seems to be falling on people. Like people are always asking, what can I do to help with climate change? Can I switch out my light bulb? Can I do this? Can I? And it's like, those are all great things, but at an individual level, that's positive and we should all try and do better. But when you see the governments who are kind of making us feel bad, they're putting the tax on us. I don't like that relationship where it feels like the onus has been put on the individual when it sounds like companies and larger industries have a larger role to play, and we don't direct that energy towards them. And I'm interested in your thoughts on perhaps these environmental organizations, because I agree with the furbearers analysis, but I don't know how you feel about them, but sometimes they feel too far. They feel too far on one side where it's hard for me as an individual to go, you're right 100% of the time. I think the furbearers page is against any hunting or trapping at all ever. And to me, it's like, as an Indigenous person, I know that communities have a relationship with their responsibilities to hunt and fish and to handle things properly. We have salmon ceremonies to give thanks when we fish, and we have a responsibility in these regards. And so when you say zero, I can't go that far with you. And so when I'm putting myself in perhaps the government shoes, I go, well, I can't listen to these people because they're too on one side. And then you go to the industries and they've got all the money and they're all on one side. And so you're not having a balanced conversation because one side you can't take too seriously and they don't have a lot of financial backing, and then the other side has all financial backing and they're going to help with your campaign next year, and they're going to help make sure that this influence and that this study is funded and all these things. And so it's easier to listen to industry than environmental organizations. So I'm interested in your thoughts. You've worked with environmental organizations a long time. What are your thoughts on perhaps the good ones or what you've experienced?
I wish more people thought like you, and you said it well. And this is actually the success of all this environmental work, is that you can have these thoughts and you can realize that there are environmental, actions and policies that have a meaning and make a difference. My friends, I'm not a member of a conservation club, except, well, I guess not any. But I have friends in there, and I admire their work. I have worked with them a lot. I've contributed objective science as best I can to help them out. I've not gone on the, I haven't, made a placard and marched the streets with them. But this is where we have had success. The very fact that we're talking about this means there's been some success. The fact that people are buying prizes, this is all success. People have taken it on an individual level, not everybody, but enough people that has made a difference. It made a market for prize cars, for example. And my wife and I at home, we limit our plastics and we do everything we can. We change our bulbs out. And we do all this thing, and all that's good. The problem is, it's not enough. And if we go back to, climate change is one thing. If we go back to the Biodiversity Convention, an awful lot of good work has been done. First of all, there's been good research by scientists showing, how to preserve not just places, but the ecological functions within those places and also outside of those places. A lot of new protected areas have been established since '88 when the first sustainability idea came out. Wilson was the guy's name. So if you look around the world and you have this convention, the Biodiversity Convention, ratified in my office, signed in Rio the previous year, '92. It mandated the countries try to protect so many percent of their country. And a lot of countries have done this. And so there have been a whole lot of, including in Canada, new territory. The problem is if you just look at caribou, well, none of those areas are in caribou habitat. A few small ones, perhaps, but they're happy to protect vast swaths of the Arctic, which I happen to love because I worked in the Arctic for years. I've seen wild polar bears and had them come into my camp. And all this. I worked with Inuit people, and I think that's wonderful to protect. For example, a great huge swath of Banks Island, another great huge swath of Bathurst Island where I worked, and other big chunks, and then northwestern BC in the Tlingit country, a huge protected area. I think it's a provincial park. I'm not sure what the designation, but it's a big area and it's protected. Some mining incursions, but we won't have to go there. But so all this has been good and successful, and as a result of all the work, smart people like yourself carrying the banner. But it hasn't. Governments, all levels, have really not stepped up to the plate, to use a baseball term. They haven't taken that idea and said, well, how will this apply to the caribou? Or what about the wolves? Are they important enough that we should resist from shooting them from planes and find some other way to solve the caribou problem? They haven't gone that far, and they're constrained because, I guess, of all powerful economics and powerful economic interests.
Right. Can we talk about wolf culling? I want to get your perspectives on what's taking place in terms of killing wolves from planes, because when I read it, it was so hard to imagine that this is happening, that this is taking place, that in British Columbia, like when I first read it, I was like, helicopters taking guns, shooting them from planes, and then it sounds like flying away. Like, to me, and like, I don't mean to lean into too much into just being Indigenous, but like that goes against this relationship we have with the environment. And I'm sure that other people would like to have stronger relationships, but Indigenous culture is very strong in that regard. We have responsibility. Like I just interviewed Sonny McKelsey, who's a Stolo historian and researcher, and he talks about the salmon ceremony and how we all share the first salmon with as many people as we can, and then we return the bones to the water, and we give thanks to that, and we say a prayer for that. And it's similar to grace in that regard of giving thanks for our food, that we would never go out and just murder on at scale a bunch of animals and then just leave and not do anything. And I think of the effects not only of just killing these wolves, which I think are admired and loved by so many people, but the research also shows that they impact mid-sized predators that allow for greater biodiversity across BC. They take out the mid-sized ones, so the little ones have actually a better chance of surviving. And so it's not just not helping the caribou. It's not just terrible for your ears or your eyes to have to read about what you're doing, but it actually has negative impacts to the biodiversity of the environment. And so can you explain how this came about and what your thoughts are on wolf culling?
Yeah. First of all, let me tell you a story. Uh, I'll make it fairly short. I was in the Arctic. This is 1973 or two, I guess. I'd hired this native guy, the Kikiza. That's Athapascan tribe. He and I were up in the high country, and the plan was to snowshoe down this river. I was studying beaver. I had a beaver study to do, so I was studying beavers, and we were going to snow down this river until spring breakup, and then build a boat and carry on down to a rendezvous place at a lake. Well, it was an ill-conceived idea, and it was totally my fault. No way I could have built a boat, even with a First Nations guy helping me. He just looked at this thing we cobbled together and scratched his head. Anyway, I could make it a longer story, but the short form is we tipped the boat over in the water still running with ice. Uh, uh, Henry scrambled up the bank. I saw he was okay, so I swam down the river, trying to find our floating stuff and throw it up on the riverbank so we wouldn't lose all of our stuff. Until my legs seized up and I just sank. And I came to leaning against a tree. I couldn't talk because, when you have severe hypothermia, your muscles just go numb. So Henry's laughing. He's got a fire going. He's thawing me out. He's got a fire, 3 feet away, 4 or 5. He's chuckling to himself. And when hours went by before I could talk, and I said, Henry, why are you laughing? We're in a hell of a fix. And he said, well, we're gonna travel like Indian now. And I realized at the time that we were carrying all this huge amount of stuff with, food from the south that I was used to, and he wouldn't have carried anything. He would have just walked off and done this beaver study with nothing. So it was a few days. There's a sub story. I won't trouble you with the details, but we could catch beaver. So we caught a beaver after 3 days. Before that, we were pretty hungry. But we caught a beaver and we cooked it in the fire. And I ate a nice thigh and threw the bone in the fire, which was my habit because I like to keep a clean camp, burn up the bones and not attract bears. Well, Henry leaped up, grabbed the bone out of the fire, and threw it in the river and looked at me like I was crazy. And he says, why did you do that? And then he realized he was talking with a southerner who didn't know the way the world worked. And then he calmed down. He explained to me, no. The beaver spirit is important here. The bones go back. Sorry. Bones go into the river. He figured he'd save my life because if I had insulted the beaver spirit so badly, something horrible would happen. And he said that.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just an old story. It reminded me of what you said, salmon bones into the rivers, beaver bones. Good for the beaver spirit to be back in the river, not all separated and burned up.
Yeah.
Anyway, I sort of got off the track, but the idea of how to shoot wolves from how to reduce the wolf population. Well, nobody likes the idea of shooting wolves from aircraft, helicopters, or you can do it from fixed wing too. But you have to land on skis and chase them into a lake. I don't think, considering all the ways you can kill wolves, I don't think that's the worst in terms of just being humane as a wolf killer. If you want to be humane, that's as good a way as any. If your idea is to get rid of the wolves, I don't like it. Recently, there's been some talk among the caribou recovery people of having First Nation people get rid of the wolves, trap, hunt, whatever, but do it on the ground. It's a more natural way to do it. Anyway, the way the idea was presented, it's more natural. It's more humane. If the First Nation people do it, then it's sort of in keeping with their traditions, and they're managing they should be managing the land themselves anyway. And as I said before, I think that would be the salvation, is having First Nations take over the management, especially these critically endangered species. So, but whether it's more humane, I've seen wolves trapped in snares. I've seen wolves, leg hold traps. It's not a humane way to do it. But I think if you have to kill wolves, doing it from a helicopter is as good a way as any in terms of being humane. It's not cheap, but if you have a lot of money to spend, and you have a lot of money to spend because your logging industry is paying good taxes, your heli skiing industry is paying good taxes, the provincial I'm sorry, I'm getting it's a little cynical here. Anyway, I don't necessarily think that shooting wolves from caribou is the worst way to shoot wolves or to kill wolves.
I just think that there's something dark about the people who have to do that and a disconnect that you have, just like when we see, I don't know if you heard about in Chilliwack, we had like the chicken event where all these chickens in this one coop, and the people working there, they started abusing these chickens, they started throwing the chickens, they started being abusive. I think that what you do when you're just, whoever's having to sit there and just shoot an animal as majestic, as well respected as a wolf, I think that that does something negative to how you identify yourself. I don't know how you, like, the reason, I believe personally that the reason that you have these respectful ways of treating animals in First Nations culture is not only their religious beliefs perhaps, but because it's a way of process. Like, you see these vegetarians and these vegans saying, I won't eat anything if it's had to be killed because I don't deserve to. I think that's them trying to cope with something that Indigenous people figured out a way to cope with, is how do I kill this animal, this life, and live with that and take on the responsibility afterwards to walk away and go, I need to be a better person now because I had to murder this beaver, I had to murder this life, and so now I have a responsibility. I don't think you get that when you're just gunning something from a helicopter, and I think that messes, I predict that would mess psychologically with whoever's having to do that, because now you just don't value anything, and it's fine to just fly overhead and kill innocent animals that don't understand what's going on. And then for those animals, you're not showing them the respect, as we described with the beaver or the salmon, of utilizing their body and appreciating their role in the ecosystem. And I think that that's all really, really bad. It might not be bad in terms of like perhaps it's better in cost, but it's worse on our civility.
I think that's right. I think you've taken complex issues, emotional ones, and boiled them down into a nutshell. Reminds me a bit of like when I was first doing those furbear studies up north in 1970. They dropped us off fixed-wing aircraft on skis on a lake, and we put up our tent 45 below, and we started studying furbearers. And we had the plane coming every couple of weeks with groceries and mail. And one week, our pilot landed and gave us the grocery and the mail. Said, "Oh, I killed a wolf on the way here." He was real proud of himself. He'd seen these wolves and used his aircraft to like chase him into the middle of the lake, and then landed on the lake, got out his rifle and shot this wolf. And he was real proud. Well, my boss, that was 1972, still my good friend. I talk to him all the time. He really upbraided the pilot who had done this. Told him, "You'll never fly with us again if I ever hear of you shooting wolves on our contract, our logistics contract, our flying contract." Says, "We don't do that, and we're not going to hire anybody who does." So this is, we're all, well, our colleague was there sort of listening in. Kiki's a guy, not Henry that I mentioned before. But basically the pilot and us two biologists, we're Southerners, we're not from that country. But two of us had the ethos of not shooting wolves just to shoot a wolf. And the pilot didn't have that ethos. He thought it was fine to chase a wolf onto a lake and shoot it. But after that incident, when we upbraided him, my boss did, my friend, he never did it again. His company, his flying company, his bush pilots, they never did. They adopted it. So I think these ideas, they can spread. And I think, as we mentioned before, all the work of the environmental groups, it does spread. And it does, you have these many small successes. You don't necessarily always get the big success that you really want, but the small successes don't, it's more than nothing. It's good, whether you're talking climate change, biodiversity, new national parks and protected areas. Back in the 60s, the fight to get rid of these chlorinated pesticides that were building up in birds' eggs and causing eagles and pelicans to decline. We've had a lot of successes, and we still can have some. But to save the caribou, we're not going to, at least not unless they change their tune.
Particularly, I just think of, like, we know that all dogs, I would say, like, I'm more of a dog person, but I would say that all dogs come from wolves, and we know that pretty clearly. And we co-evolved with them over time. And so just to think about the impact that we're having on a species that we've had such a long, strong relationship with, and to do it in this way, it just seems it seems really dark to think of when you look at your dog, it came from a wolf, like its lineage goes all the way back to those animals, and we have this long-standing beautiful relationship. I watched a Netflix series called Explained, and they do one on dogs specifically, and they say that over time, wolves realized that they could work with humans, and so their emotional states became intertwined with ours so that they could regulate our emotions, which is why they work so well as support animals, as police dogs, that they've really grown to understand how to connect with a person. And I think that's beautiful. And I think of those wolves were the first, and we're so lucky to have had that evolution with them and to do what we're doing. Like I'm not against conservation. I'm not against the idea that perhaps we do need to bring down wolf populations for a variety of reasons. I'm okay if the science says that needs to be done, but I think that we need to honor these animals in a better way than we are, for not only them but for ourselves, for our own. Because reading that made me feel terrible about humans, because then it's just like another one of those moments of like when you hear about a bear accidentally wandered around like a community too long, so they killed it. It's like, that doesn't make me feel good. That doesn't make me feel like we're good stewards of the environment. And reading that we're killing them from helicopters just again makes me go, like, how can we say we care so much, and how can that be the headline when we're doing and behaving this way? Because perhaps it needs to be done, but there has to be a better, more friendly way of going about that, to take up the responsibility. Because again, we might have a role to play in controlling the amount of predators and prey, but if we don't take on that responsibility 100%, you end up in a helicopter shooting animals from the sky and saying that you're being a good conservationist. And there's no part of, I think, most people that feels like that's the way conservation should be, that's the gold standard of where we should take this.
It's statements like that that make me think there's hope. And like I said, shooting wolves from helicopters, it seems wrong. For me, it's just disgusting. It's unconscionable. And yet, irrationally, if you have to shoot wolves, it's probably as good, or if you have to kill wolves, it's probably as good a way as any to do it. I'd rather going back to my conversation with the pilot in 1972, who killed a wolf, on our charter. I think it's wrong and it shouldn't be done. There should be another way to solve the problem. And with wolves and caribou, there is another way to solve the problem, and that is protect the habitat and get rid of the snowmobiles that are in their critical winter habitat. And if you would do that first, and then if you had to kill a few wolves to increase recruitment among the caribou populations, then find a good way to do it. I think this whole idea is wrong. And again, I reiterate, I'm not against killing wolves per se. I'm against killing wolves and not solving the other problems that are bringing down the caribou populations.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a bit about your background? Where did you go to school, and how did you kind of become a biologist?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mentioned at the start, I was born and raised in California, and I went to school in a little mountain town in northeastern California, and there was lots of wildlife. My buddies and I hunted, we hunted during hunting season and fished all the rest of the year, and got our, went skiing and did winter sport. We were always outside, but wildlife was important to us, and we always hunted and fished. So when I went to college, I stumbled a bit. It took a while to find my direction, but then I got into the wildlife program and got a degree in wildlife management, and so still in California. But then learning about wildlife management from a professional wildlife management point of view, I started realizing that wildlife habitat is pretty well used up in large parts of California. There just wasn't much left. There's still, relic populations here and there, bighorn sheep, elk, but they're just few and far between compared to a century past. And as I neared graduation, I started remembering when I was 7, my family took a whole summer and we went driving all around the western states and up through Alberta and British Columbia. And I started thinking as I was in college nearing graduation that, Canada is a pretty nice place. There's places there where still there's lots of wildlife. Habitat isn't all ruined and used up and polluted. And then there was also the Vietnam War was going on, and I thought it was wrong. Geopolitically, it was wrong. Morally, it was wrong. I didn't want to go and fight the war, and so I had another reason to go to Canada. So I came to Canada as a draft dodger, but also because I wanted to start a career in wildlife, wildlife management, wildlife biology, wildlife research.
At the time, was it tough to come to Canada, being accused of being a draft dodger? Was that something that was, because I'm sure, like now looking back on it, of course, things did not play out the way I think the United States expected it to. But during that time, was that a tough decision at all?
It was a tough decision, not because I never got any bad vibes within Canada for my decision to avoid the draft and come to Canada. I did have some bad vibes among my family, who tend to be conservative, and colleagues in university and so on. But you make your decision and you follow your path. And I never had any regrets, and never, like I say, being in Canada, I never had any problems from that point of view in Canada. I had a good career. I worked for a series of consulting companies, and then went to work for the government and became a Canadian citizen.
We don't have anything like the draft today, and I've never grown up with the draft existing. And in Canada, it's been used very, very rarely. I think only at heights in World War I and II. And so that's why I'm interested. Is I can't imagine that pressure from your family to do something like that. Like, we don't have anything like that today, where we would feel pressure to do something like that, and to have to make a moral decision for yourself in that regard, where the stakes are so high to go to another country and fight, or to have to figure out how you're going to handle this. It's like we don't have anything comparable today.
No, thankfully.
Yeah.
Not much I can say about that. Among my high school buddies, we're all on the track team, football team, good close friends, hunted and fished together. And we made different decisions. Some got drafted and went to the war. Some took officer training and, flew a jet or whatever. And some took alternative service, went to Alaska and worked in a hospital or whatever, and I went to Canada. Interestingly, I had a little get together with this is sort of off the topic of wolves and everything, but
No worries.
A few years, 10 years ago, I had a little mini reunion with those guys, my high school buddies, who some had fought in war, Vietnam War, and the ones that came back. And also the guys that went to Alaska and myself, we all got together. And even from those guys who fought in that horrible war, I didn't get any bad vibes from them for having gone to Canada. It's good, not at all.
Yeah, it's so tough to think about looking back in hindsight, because now it played out so differently than people would have expected. Because there's a part of patriotism, there's a sense of community, there's a sense of responsibility, and there's got to be so much pulling from you from all sides. And so it's good that you were, like, it sounds like you got some closure from that to be able to know and to put that decision to rest.
I've had a really blessed career, to be honest. I've had, my whole life has been like a series of dreams come true. I told you I had, ever since I came to Canada at first, when I was 7 years old, I thought the idea of building a cabin in the wilderness was something I wanted to do, and I did it. I went to work as a wildlife biologist and, all around the Arctic and the North, and I did that. It was a dream come true, and seeing the undisturbed northern wildlife, was a wildlife biologist's dream. I have to say, working with First Nations people was also a real treat. They were more or less undamaged. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but the people up and all of them down in Mackenzie, were following their traditional way of life. And it was a big time of change for them because the Berger Inquiry was coming up and there were big changes. Mackenzie Valley Pipeline was going to bring big changes to all the communities. And we worked with those guys. Every time we started, say, my buddy and I told you about it, was my boss, but now my friend, both biologists, same age. Our modus operandus, we'd go into a village where we wanted to do a study, meet the chief, explain the study, asked to be introduced to the trapper who trapped in the area where we wanted to do our study. Of course, we were studying furbearers. He and I were. Others in the team were studying caribou or whatever. We were studying furbearers, marten, mink, lynx, beavers, muskrat. So then we'd meet the guy who trapped in that area, and usually we'd make some accommodation for him. He'd help us move our gear. He'd bring his dog team or whatever, his boat, move our stuff. He'd live with us. So I got to live and work with those guys, and that was a real treat. Just seeing how they lived, in the old days, seeing how their technology, how they manage their dogs, how they manage their toboggans, how they eat while they're on the trail. They make bannock, they dry fish, they bring along the dry fish, they bring along the dry meat, they collect things while they're out. That was a real treat. Another real treat that was related was, the Berger Inquiry was going on. Our studies were related to the Berger Inquiry, this Northern Pipeline thing. We were doing the environmental impact. So we met a lot of old guys and a lot of young guys. The chiefs were all old. They were like the sage elders of their communities. But during the time, the few years, 4 or 5 years that I did that work, in virtually every community, there was a turnover in the chiefs. And the old guys, and they had to go and make submissions to the British Inquiry. They had to give the benefit of their knowledge and wisdom to the British Inquiry about it's their land and it's their wildlife and how to protect it, what their concerns were. Well, there was a turnover, and who initiated, I don't know, but it was the same like every single village that we worked at. A young guy who had some education would become chief. Not young, not as young as you, of course, but guys in their 30s and 40s were becoming chiefs. And that was because the communities were realizing that you needed an English-speaking guy who understood the white culture, the Southern culture, the problems as well as the bad as well as the good, and could go to the inquiry. They also had these community meetings, not just in Yellowknife, but every community. So there was a turnover in the people, the elected chiefs. An outcome of that process, this was mid-70s, an outcome of that was the land claims. When having gone to the Yellowknife or attended the community hearing with Berger and all the lawyers and all the Southerners and all the big money people and all the engineering companies and the pipeline companies and oil and gas companies, and seeing what's at risk in their country, a lot of them started saying, well, really, and there were international things too. There was, well, I don't have to tell you about the international thing, but there was global ideas that people who are from an area and who can trace their lineage back to time immemorial should have a say in how the area is managed, and maybe should do the management themselves. So in Mackenzie and also in Nunavut, Inuit country, they put forward these, and also in Yukon where I also work, they put forward these, call them land claims at first, but land claims co-management treaties. They basically took over management, so that now when you go to I went back to Resolute Bay a few years ago on a government contract and looked up some old people. When I first started, there would have been sorry for, I don't mean to be using characterizations that are unfair, but there would be a white guy who would be the game manager, and he's who we would meet with. I told her we also met, if we were doing a study, we would meet the chief and etc. Meet the trappers, but there would be a white guy who was in charge of managing. Well, now no. You go to when I went to Resolute Bay, I didn't. Was there even a white guy even involved in that? There was who you met with was the Hunters and Trappers Association. These were the Inuit people who were out on the land. They hunted and they trapped. They brought they brought in the muskoxen and the caribou and the fish, and they brought furs to sell, and they were in charge of the communities. But they were the responsible people in their communities. But they were also elected officials. If it was a chief, and there are also the Hunters and Trappers Association, and then there's a Nunavut-wide sort of land management council with different subgroups. There's like the wildlife; these are like for the whole of Nunavut. So these Hunters and Trappers Associations, composed of the guys who are on the land and had been on the land, since their ancestors' time, they're the ones making decisions now, and I think it's wonderful. I mean, I saw it evolve from being totally directed from outside forces to being at least largely directed from within. Uh, Getting back to caribou, I think this idea of the Soto and those other peoples up around Chetwynd, I think that's the way to do it. Problem is in the Arrow Lakes. The Arrow Lakes people were declared extinct a few decades ago by the federal government. So there's no like First Nations institution or organization within that particular valley. There is further east, the Ktunaxa people.
Right. It sounds like what you're also saying, though, is that this is a problem that's better addressed perhaps at like First Nations communities are, I usually compare them to like a municipality, that it's better done by a lower level of government where the people actually live there. They actually care. It's tough when your decisions about your community, your cabin, it sounds like, are being dictated by people who live in Victoria, who don't see caribou every day, who don't care because it's not in their backyard. And so it seems like this is like an authority, ideally, that would be moved to like the municipal level, because the community members who live in that community actually go for walks and actually get to see the wildlife in their area. And instead of having a provincial government of somebody who lives in a high rise in Vancouver making the decisions about the wildlife that exists hundreds of kilometers from them, that they're never going to go see, that they're never going to take off their suit and start exploring the wilderness, these people aren't the best people to be making the decision. So perhaps moving it to the municipal level would have some impact, because then it's your city council, and then you can elect them to start to make decisions about the ecosystems that exist in your area, rather than all the way in Victoria or in Ottawa, where these people have no real relationship or understanding of what's taking place. Why do these animals matter? What is it like to see this animal? Because for me, I've never seen a wolf in person. I've never seen a caribou in person. And so it's all theoretical until I'm out there looking at the animal and going, wow, it's in its natural environment. This is how it's living.
Yeah, this is the idea of devolution from higher levels of government giving their authority down to lower levels, and it's a good idea. It can be overdone because at some point, if you push big responsibilities down too low, then you get people who don't see the big picture, don't have big enough responsibilities. But so there's always a balance and a trade-off between what exactly. I'm talking about governance issues, but I don't really know anything about governance. It's just what I've picked up over the years. But I think it's right. But First Nations are a little bit more complex than just devolution to a lower level of government, because they have this. Well, it's like a family. It's like my family. We have our history and the places that are important to us, but mine are scattered all over the northern hemisphere. The First Nations, in many cases, by and large, are they have an intimate connection with this land, this place. Like my friends up north, Henry, the Kakisa guy who pulled me out of the freezing water, and then went on to become a counselor. And his dad was chief, and he went to the Bird Inquiry. This is important. I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have given his speech. I read his speech years later, just out of curiosity. And he stood up in front of the inquiry, and God, he was erudite and thoughtful and fair and balanced, and he gave a nice detailed account of his and his community's interest in the land. I couldn't have done it with even being a scientist and having collected all this information about the physical environment and the biological environment. We don't have that sort of societal connection. I'll tell you another little I like telling stories. You can edit this out.
No, this is why we're here. This is why I make them 3 hours.
It's a little bit off the track, but I was one of my career things is wildlife toxicology. After I quit the government, and I worked until I could, for various reasons, came together and I could take early retirement when I was 50. This was 20-some years ago. So then I quit the government, took my early retirement package, paid off my mortgage, went consulting. But one of the things I could consult with, good, because I had some history and some contacts, was wildlife toxicology. So I did some wildlife toxicological studies for various companies, mostly mining companies, not entirely, some oil and gas. So my clients were mining companies at the start, but later some of my clients were actually First Nations. So I'd be on this side of the table, with the mining engineers and vice presidents, and then sometimes I'd be meeting with the same people, but I'd be sitting on the other side with my First Nations client. Usually it was the other way around. But the thing is that these are like issues over mining licenses and operating permits. How do you develop a new mine without damaging the things that are important in the environment? So the First Nations representatives, they're always well prepared, at least as well prepared as I was, and I'm a good biologist. I know my job, and these guys were in the same category. We were like peers in that sense. We were specialists in our respective things, and they didn't just limit their conversation, where the good berry picking was. I don't mean to be unfairly characterizing anybody, but they came armed with technical things about exfiltration and the ions and the data from the wells, and they could trace the flow, conceptually, as well as on maps and diagrams and figures of contaminants through the environment and various kinds of subsurface ground and whatever. And I found myself thinking, if these guys, if these First Nations guys, these Aboriginal people, if they were just given the responsibility, the whole responsibility, or if they wrest it from whoever has it, either way, whether it's given or taken, but if they had the responsibility of managing their environment, we could do a lot worse. We're actually doing worse than if they would take over. And how to make it happen, I don't know. But the Silcotin people, they had that big treaty. They got rights and title to a big area. There was a hue and cry in the newspapers. Well, the economic interests were at risk because they couldn't foresee how the Silcotin people were going to manage exercise their newfound rights and title without damaging somebody else's former rights. But that's not how it works. It's good for the environment. It's good for the wolves. It's good for the caribou to have people who live there, who have always lived there, take over the management. I mean, I saw that in the Arctic, with the hunters and trappers committees now, making the decisions on hunting and trapping. I think it's therein lies, if not all the solution, at least a big part of the solution.
Yeah, that is what I read in the Marshall decision, which was about it was a more Ontario side decision, but the idea that the Supreme Court came to was like, well, you can have your rights, but we need to maintain conservation. And it's like, oh, well, you don't really understand First Nations people then, because that's like our primary objective. And it seems like from what you're saying that we take that as seriously, if not more seriously, than the claims that governments make to the idea of conservation. That because it's been here for so long, we actually are committed to it. Where when you're in a board meeting in a building and you're all discussing how we're going to save the caribou, that it's all a little artificial. You're not there. You don't understand those animals. You don't understand the relationship you've had for years. You don't have stories about them that make you value them more and that give you that deeper connection. And I think it's perhaps one of the limitations that, like, because I see the stories of Indigenous people and the Bible as somewhat comparable to the morality that they teach you. First Nations people, we use them for geographic locations. So I had, as I said, Sonny McKelsey on, and he was describing what Mount Chiam means, wild strawberries at the top. And so that's what, yeah, that's what and then there is still that strawberry patch at the top. And so we have these stories that give us a relationship with the land. So if you were coming here from Yukon or from different areas, you'd be able to figure out where you are based on these stories. And that gives you a deeper relationship. And I think it's comparable to the idea of Noah and the Ark, where you have this story of this one individual, the flood comes, and he saves the animals. He takes responsibility for the environment by trying to save them. Whether that literally happened or not, I think we don't have to get lost in that, because we understand that the responsibility of people is to protect the wildlife. And when you're, again, in a high rise in a building and you're looking at graphs and figures, it's so artificial in comparison to somebody who's been out there, who's looked at these animals and had that deeper respect.
One of my last responsibilities before I left the government, I was working for the Wildlife Service, and they put me in charge of negotiating the First Nations treaty rights and developing co-management agreements for wildlife management, just the wildlife part, not the whole environment part. But I was responsible for working on individual treaties and land claims, and also on. I went to Ottawa and I worked with the policy people on developing policies to do this. What was permissible in a co-management agreement for wildlife management with a hypothetical First Nation. And so there were federal policies that were written in stone, were given to us to start with. But the woman I worked with in Ottawa, who was in charge of the section, that was like I was just doing the regional thing, right? I worked on half a dozen or more, a dozen or so of the so-called tables, Kitsalt, and so on. She was a First Nation herself. She was part Cree and part Chippewa, I forget. But she was a First Nation woman, a lawyer, and a biologist. She had three really good credentials to be head of that section. And she and I worked closely together. We sort of sat there, over many months, worked out, here's the sort of the policy statement, here's what it would mean in practice, and, putting down. And this point that you've mentioned several times today about the rights to manage, except up to the point where conservation becomes a concern. We got stuck on this, and I kept saying, well, I mean, I'm steeped in government. University, Southern University in government. I have a respect for authority, and the laws are such and such, and the organizational structure is such and such. And we got into a tough argument about this. When should the conservation clause kick in? Is it even necessary? like a co-management agreement or land claim or a treaty. And she was having a hard time making me understand that the First Nations who would be negotiating these treaties, land claims agreements, they have all they need in their own community to take on the issue of when should conservation clauses kick in. When do caribou become so scarce we have to kill wolves, or if we have to kill wolves, how do we do it, or whatever. And I was saying, it's got to be in writing. Say, for example, I put forward the idea, well, how about up until it becomes officially declared as threatened? Then the native right and title would have to be abrogated in terms of conserving whatever species we're talking about. And she would say, why would you think that? No, she said, the people who managing, who are from there, who have elders who remember the old days, they know. And one thing she said to me when we were having a particularly tough conversation, she said, Lee, if I can't make you understand, me, meaning, I've worked with First Nations people. I've told you some of my history. I have had friends all up and down Mackenzie, trappers and their families. Have had these deep relationships and experience that I treasure. And she said, Lee, if I can't make you understand, how am I going to make the average bureaucrat or politician understand? And she was right. I was stuck. I was stuck in my own history. Sorry.
No. I think it's incredibly brave to be able to see that and to understand our relationship and to be able to change your perspective, because that's often where people get stuck, right? And you've shown that throughout this conversation, is that you're not committed to one side. You're evolving with the science. You're willing to admit that overall the study may come to the same conclusion, but there were these few errors that needed to be acknowledged and addressed. That balanced perspective is why I thought it was important to have someone like yourself on, because I did see that your article was referenced by an extremely one-sided perspective, but I saw through your work and through our conversations that you had a very balanced perspective, and you just want what's best for the environment, for the people who get to experience these lands. It's why you chose to move where you live today and have that cabin, and for you to be able to own that, I think sets an example for so many other people. It's why I like talking to leaders and role models like yourself, is because if we can't admit where we're wrong, there's nowhere else to go. There's no more progress that can be made because we get stuck. And that ability to share that story, I think, is so valuable.
Well, she was right. And they still haven't solved all those problems either.
Yeah.
I left, and I probably wasn't the worst they could have had in that position either.
Yeah, I think of decisions and like how interviewing various people, and like these stories seem to have such a strong impact on people. But I do think that the best hands are individuals like yourselves, are able to review the information and try and make good decisions, whether it's in a community, whether it's biology. And that ownership, I think, is so... I interviewed Karen Bondar, and I don't know if you've heard of her, but she's a science communicator. She's been on Netflix, National Geographic, various platforms to talk about science communication. And she's been pushing the idea of making our relationship with First Nations community stronger, because they see these relationships and they value them, and they have stories about the caribou, or they have a deeper relationship with these animals that gives us a greater appreciation. And I think that that's what strong environmentalists are working towards. They want that connection. Again, as I said, vegans, vegetarians, people who've made those decisions, I think they're craving, they really want that relationship. And it's something that you don't hear about ever. When you go for dinner, there's no grace anymore. And whether or not you're religious or not, you should appreciate what you're eating. Because the other part I wanted to ask you about for me, I've never seen a grizzly bear. I've never gotten to see otters in their natural environment or beavers doing their own thing. We saw a beaver once at a pond, but it's again, it's artificial. It's not them working like they had like rules around making sure that the beavers couldn't build dams. And like when I saw this beaver, I was like, this is so artificial in that it doesn't get to be a beaver. Beavers like to build dams. You can't build dams here, so it's really just kind of swimming around, kind of stuck. And so I'm interested to know what some of your experiences of being able to be in nature, in wildlife, not on the main trail. Like when we go for walks, we're on a trail. It's basically paved. It's not the same as what you've experienced where you chose to live and have a cabin in the woods. That relationship, it seems like it's falling away. There's less and less people who have that relationship with the wilderness and with being able to be comfortable saying like, okay, I have to go hunt for my food now. That's lacking, and I think hunters set such a good example in terms of their willingness to be conservationists. To like a lot of in the United States, I know a lot of the money that they pay for tags and stuff goes back into conservation, and many people don't realize that. They get freaked out with the word hunting, and they go, "You kill an animal," but I think that gives you that deeper relationship with the animal.
Canada too. A big part of our hunting licenses goes to habitat conservation.
Yeah, and so you have this deeper relationship with your food that you lose when you're at a Walmart and you're picking up 25 chicken breasts for $12. You have no relationship with that animal. You have no understanding of its life and what it went through. Whereas when you shoot something or when you have to kill something, you have a strong relationship. So what have those experiences been like to be out in the wilderness?
Well, I mean, I just treasure. I told you before, my whole life has been a series of dreams come true. Being able to go up in the Arctic and see a live polar bear and see 65,000 caribou all in one herd. Catching these big fish. Cast a lure, catch a fish. Uh, Seeing all the different kinds of environments. The alpine country in northern BC where the caribou live, and the Arctic tundra where the different kind of caribou lives, and the grizzly bears. And, I've treasured that. I've often thought, I mean, I know a lot of people don't have those experiences, never seen a wild polar bear or grizzly even. And here we live in grizzly country. I don't know what the solution is, except that the more people who have these experiences, who get closer to nature, I think the better off we'll all be. Even if they just take, elementary school class out and look at butterflies. They should at least do that. If that's all they can do, then they should do that and try to instill. And a lot of our new people coming from foreign shores who haven't got even as much sort of historical empathy with the natural environment as we do. They need to be introduced to the natural environment. I think the more people who get out and get a chance to see even a deer, never mind a caribou or a grizzly bear, the better off we'll be. I mentored a Syrian family. This is totally off the topic, but I was doing my civic duty, and the Syrian people were coming over. They were looking for volunteers. I volunteered to be a mentor for a new Syrian family that from a war zone, didn't speak any English.
How long ago was this?
2 or 3 years. I mentored them for 2 or 3 years until I saw they got on their feet. Young woman, 3 kids, husband killed in the war. A horrible story. I just started showing her the natural environment around. I mean, they live in Coquitlam, but one of the things I thought, well, I can do for them, well, I'll show them. So I took them and saw a waterfall. They'd never seen a waterfall. There's not enough water anywhere in Syria that it could like fall over a rock or come out of a mountain. I took them to see the salmon spawn, and a couple on a river, and big salmon and water flowing down, and even walks around the town here, different place. I took them different place every week, like for 3 years, different natural place to introduce them to Canada. This is Canada. Yeah, we have mountains. Well, the first day when I took them out, I drove them. They had a medical appointment, so I went to Burnaby. coming back, I said, "You mind if we take the inlet in different way?" And okay, well, we stopped along at the Bartley Marine Park, and they're looking at these huge cottonwood trees. They'd never. There was just when they just arrived. They'd never seen anything like that. Well, if more people like that could be, introduced to what's natural, I think the better off we'll be. And I think it starts early. It starts early, and you need to, get your toe on the accelerator and keep it there, and take all the classes out as often as you can, winter and summer, rain and shine. Let them go out and show them a deer. If all you can find is a deer, then show them a deer.
Yeah, I think about, I don't know if you heard in the news recently, they decided to allow um, doctors to prescribe going to national parks.
Oh yeah.
And they get cards now, and they can get that prescribed. And I thought, what a good idea. And I of course support it. But then it was kind of like, the other part of me was like, where are we where we need that prescribed to us? Like I think of my grandmother, like everybody I know who's older than me has been like, we used to go out into the forest and we just used to get lost for a while and just explore and enjoy ourselves. And so like, where have we gotten to where we need that prescribed to us in order for us to go and do that, in order to think we should be out in nature? Because I interviewed, I don't know if you know him, Brian Minter. He ran Minter Country Gardens.
I met him.
Yes, and so he talked about how an hour in like real forest actually boosts your immune system. And it's like, there's scientific reasons, there's health reasons, there's so many reasons to return to these environments. It humbles you, I think, when you interact with certain animals. You kind of remember, oh, I'm just a part of this. I also interviewed Elder Eddie Gardner, and he has like a deep respect. And my favorite part was when he described trees. He didn't call them trees, he said the rooted ones. And when he described bugs, he called them the ones that crawl. Because he doesn't, like, I think of bugs and I go, get that mosquito, get that bug off me. But he didn't look at them that way, because they're all a part, and they all have a role to play in our environment. And then you think of like, I hear a lot of friends go like, oh, there's a spider. And then there's always somebody who will go like, yeah, but we need the spiders. And then it's like, there's a bee. And then people are like, you need the bees. And it's like, we need all of it. Like we have this deep relationship with everything around us. And when you start to learn about that, to me, I don't know, it makes you full. When we've been learning more about mushrooms and how they help trees grow, and how they help the deformed wing virus in bees. And like, you learn about these complex relationships that it humbles me, and it makes me grateful that, like, it makes me respect, I guess, the wilderness more, and understand that we're just a small part of this.
Well, the earth has been here a long time. It's been evolving, all of, the bees and the spiders and everything, since long before we were here, and we've been here relatively recently. But we are a part of the environment. We spring from the environment. And the more people who can keep that perspective, that feeling of being part of the environment, I think the better off we'll be.
Absolutely. Can you tell us just a little bit about your family life? When did you meet your wife, and how did that kind of come about with your work in biology? Was she originally from Canada as well, or how did that come about?
She hired me. A nice Jewish girl from Winnipeg, and I'd worked up north in a company in Edmonton, and I changed to a different company, still working up north, but the company was in Vancouver. She's the one that hired me she was in charge of hiring for that environmental consulting company. And one thing leads to another. So she's my wife, and we have our two kids and three grandkids. And the grandkids live in Revelstoke, and they've never seen a caribou. My son has seen a caribou, as I told you before. And my daughter, 40, she's doesn't have any kids, no permanent boyfriend. She's a really good mountain girl, though. She just loves to go out in the mountains, and she'll say, "Dad, let's get the canoe and go for a long canoe ride." And she and I'll take the canoe out, or she takes her friends camping and fishing and canoeing and hiking. She's a good hiker, and so she's close to she's not a biologist, you know. And I think my son is more lives up in Rebels Lake. He's a chef. He's more of a close to the land in terms of like picking mushrooms, and uh, he's more. She's more of a she visits more of a visitor environment. She's good though. She's a good mountain girl. She spends a lot of time in the trails and pathways,
Right.
and he's the one that he cuts firewood to heat his house and picks mushrooms. Grows a lot of vegetables and plants and stuff.
That's amazing.
So it's nice to have that kind of family ties.
Yeah, how did you guys go about decide? Were you the one who said we got to get a cabin up north here, and she was on board, or were you both on the same page about where you wanted to?
Oh, I already had my cabin by the time I met her.
Okay,
I built the cabin not long before, a couple of years, I guess.
hold on, you built it?
Yeah.
Like you got the wood, you started building this place?
Yeah, I bought 60 acres of land and a home light chainsaw.
Wow.
And I cut the trees, peeled them, dragged them into place, cut the notches, and made a cabin. Then my first cabin now is owned by my niece. Been some changes, but we have a little family enclave down there. My old property I sold to my sister and her husband, who was one of these guys I mentioned that was on the track in high school, on the track team. And one of my buddies from high school married my sister. Long story, but they now own my old property, the 60 acres that I had. And I've got my little cabin. My son's got a cabin there, nice little timber frame house that he and I built together. Cut the trees, made the notches and put up the timbers. And so that's 4 little cabins.
Oh, just pull it up.
That's 4 little cabins. My old cabin, Carol and Charles' cabin, and my sister. My cabin, my new one. Then I bought another property nearby. And then my son. So we have a little family enclave, and it's nice to get together and share this love of the nature and environment and have some history with the place.
Absolutely, and it sounds like you've kind of built that into your family unit, that you value the environment, and that you've encouraged that, because so many people live in cities now that Revelstoke and those areas are much more peaceful. There's much more opportunities to reconnect with nature.
Yeah. I was lucky in that my family back in California, well, it sort of starts with bad luck. My grandfather settled in Bakersfield, and started raising a family, and the problem is that there was polio and some other diseases that seemed to always come in the summertime. So people who had the wherewithal to get out of town for the summer, they did. And so my granddad had, leased a Forest Service lot in the the forest, giant sequoia forest, and built a cabin. And then my dad, his brothers, rebuilt it. And now eventually passed to my cousin, and now to my nephew, same cabin. But the whole family, the extended family, the clan, and family friends, spent all of our summers at that cabin. My dad was a teacher, so he had his summers free. So we all just roamed around the woods. It wasn't wilderness exactly, but it was up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. It was pretty wild. There were lots of deer, but there were also bears and cougars and ways to get hurt. There were rattlesnakes, and we all shared that thing with that particular cabin. And this is probably, I'm sure that's the root of plus my trip up through Alberta and B.C. that I told you about. I had this idea that I wanted to build a cabin in the wilderness. Plus some books I'd read. Heidi. You know the story about Heidi?
No.
Heidi. This story was set in the Alps somewhere. I don't know where, French or Swiss Alps. Heidi was a little mountain girl. They had lived in a town in the mountains, and I don't even remember the story now. Look it up. You'll have to look it up.
Okay.
They had in Europe, in the mountains, throughout Norway and all the mountain parts of Europe, because of the environment, they have way up high in the mountains, they have a little cabin where they spend their summers with their livestock, their sheep, cows, and then they have their main home in the village or the farm down below. So I don't remember what the story was about Heidi, but there was a children's book about Heidi, and she would go and spend her summers up in this alpine meadows with beautiful scenery, at least as illustrated in the book, and the wildflowers. This is one of the influences. I always had the idea of building a cabin amidst the wildflowers and trees and natural environment. And then having the family cabin in California, it's natural for me to want to go to Canada and have a cabin, which then became sort of the nucleus of a family enclave.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Yeah, but I was lucky. Not everybody has that, and not everybody has the wherewithal to build a cabin. I mean, fortunately, we have national parks and provincial parks, and sometimes I've thought maybe I would have done better without a cabin, because I would have explored more widely and gotten to know the province. I know the province pretty well, but there are parts of the province I haven't been to. I don't know. It's you wonder if it could have done a different way and had it. I'm happy the way it turned out. I'm really happy with my experiences in my life.
Yeah, and it's not over, so I'm sure if there's certain areas you want to check out, you can. Can you tell us what individuals listening can do if they're interested in trying to address some of the things we've talked about here today? Is there like ways they can donate to something? Is there wildlife conservation organizations that you think are high quality in comparison to perhaps some of the more extreme viewpoints? What can people do if they care about the wolves, if they care about the caribou? Is there anything that people can do to try and address these things in their own lives?
Yes, I'll have to think about this, but certainly donating to the groups like the Valhalla Society or Eco Justice, who does good work in the legal area. You probably know them. Making those donations is good. I think bringing yourself and your kids up with a desire to have good knowledge and extensive knowledge would be a good thing. If you can steer your kids into science, at least have them take some science courses. I think science should be more valued. This whole climate denial business was anti-science, and since then we've seen a lot of other anti-science sort of streams of vile. I think science should be encouraged. Writing should be encouraged. I think if people write about their experiences, then they'll value their own experiences more. I think people should be encouraged to write and to write properly. And this means good English, not what you might get on, I don't know, Twitter or whatever.
Yeah.
And like I said before, get people, students especially, get out into the natural environment. Go for picnics. When I was little, everybody went for picnics all the time. It was just a thing that families did. They would get together a picnic basket and get in the old jalopy or take a bus even and just go out in some wild place and have a picnic. No, nobody takes picnics. Picnics it was a good idea. Go camping, even if it's just a Golden Ears Park, which is just on our doorstep, But there are a lot of places around here. Go camping, see the environment, fishing. I think the more time people spend in the natural environment, the better off the environment's going to be, and the better off the people will be. You mentioned the trees. The Japanese have a word for it. Forest bathing is how it translates. Forest bathing. You go out into the forest and you bathe in the forest. You let the good vibes or whatever soak into you from the forest. Forest bathing.
There is so much to learn from these cultures, and like they might not have known the exact science of the immune systems or anything like that, but they they knew enough and they were aware of the benefits. And I think that that's so important. I really appreciate you being willing to drive all the way out here today. I really appreciated our online dialogues. I think that individuals like yourself are so important because you didn't come down on one side or the other side. You respect the need for economies and for development, but you also think that they can be limited to make sure that we don't lose species, to lose the biodiversity. And I think that it's so valuable that you were able to say this study could have been improved in these ways and it had errors. It was not perfectly done. If they did these changes, we could have gotten more reliable data on this. I think that your critiques of the government are well founded, but again, you're not one side or the other. Your humility in regards to First Nations communities and their culture, I think, is so valuable because I think that the more biology, the more the sciences can work together collaboratively with ancient understandings and knowledge and community understanding, I think the stronger our country and our communities can become. To me, that's what reconciliation looks like, is bringing the best of the two worldviews together, and seeing what new we can make from that. And I think that that's the example you set by sharing your work. And I think that we're very lucky to have individuals like yourself who are willing to look at the articles and to critique them where critique is needed and to offer ways forward for others. And I really appreciate you being willing to share all of this with us today and your personal stories.
Absolutely. Well, it's been a pleasurable conversation. Thanks for inviting me.